Hey everyone, would you like to see the best game that Beth Harmon ever played? I'm Grandmaster Max Lingworth, and I will be taking you through Beth Harmon's Brilliancy against Borgov, the world champion in the show The Queen's Gambit on Netflix. See, it's a really spectacular game, and I'm really excited to show you the brilliant sacrifices and combinations that Beth played to defeat her esteemed opponent. So let's begin. We had d4, d5, c4. I don't know whether Borgov took a time machine or not, but he decided to play the Queen's Gambit accepted that I've recommended to many of my students as well. It's where you get a nice open position to start the game. Beth went straight for the move e4 here. And, previously they had done a little dress rehearsal and, in the exhibition they got the move order quite wrong. But in this game we got it right. And now, what Borgov played is the move knight to c6. But knight c6 is actually not the best move in this position, and the reason is that knight is going to get kicked around by that pawn later. A better option instead is to either play the move e5, sort of saying, well, you can only take one of my pawns at a time, and if you take here, then you are going to lose the right to castle and will be crying all the way back to the US. Of course, a better move for white is knight f3, and sacking the pawn in order to get a nice lead in development with fast kingside development, in the style of the romantics like Morphy and Greco. Or you could play a move like knight f6, playing what I like to call the improved Alekhine, where you provoke the pawn forward in order to give that knight a juicy outpost on d5. That's the way I recommend in the chess improvement repertoire, but let's see how the game went. Borgov played knight c6. Now I think white's best move is to go knight f3, so that we can play d5, but without running into annoying knight e5 and the knight jumping all over the place like it's equestrian race. But instead we had bishop e3, an old school kind of move, and then after knight f6, knight to c3. Well, you can see that black is trying to hit the pawn, so white doesn't have time to go yum-yums on here. Well, black played e5, hitting back in the center. I mean, that's the reason usually play d takes c4. You can thrust back with e5 at the right moment and do a little rate along the way. Well, the game continued with d5. And now here's where Borgov didn't know an absolutely brilliant idea. Once you see it, you'll remember it for the rest of your life. You see, Borgov decided to play the passive move knight e7, putting his own bishop right in the block. But the move that should have been played was knight a5. Now you might think, well, hold on, Max, what about the move queen a4 here? But here is where we can be very, very creative. We're not forced to play the boring old c6 and have a symmetrical position inequality. No, what we can do is we can play the move bishop to d7. And then if queen a5, we can go a6 and say, hey, your queen's trapped with b6. What are you going to do about it? So if you want, actually there is a good move that white can play in this position. And that move is to save the queen with the move knight to b1, so that the queen can at least run to safety. And then if knight e4, then there's a move d6. And by creating this hidey hole for the queen, well, this would give white an edge. So it turns out the boring old c6 is the best move after all, but I did tell you it was a beautiful idea. Didn't necessarily tell you the idea would work. Well, in any case, Borgov, as I mentioned before, played knight e7. Beth took the pawn with bishop takes c4, used the pawn to press the clock. And then we had knight take g6. Now in this position, I think that white should just develop normally. Play moves like knight f3, castles, and just sit on your space advantage. The computer wants to do some weird stuff like h4 and, start playing soccer with the pawn, but, Team Stockfish is set to, football setting, not chess setting. Well, in the game, we had Beth play the move f3, trying to build a nice same-ish pawn chain, but it does take away this square from the knight, so not the biggest fan of it. Well, we had bishop d6, and white continued to play creatively with queen d2, bishop d7. I would have expected black to castle, but maybe he was afraid of the big pawn storm. Because one thing with Beth is that she never drew. She either won or she lost. For her, drawing was worse than losing. It was like sort of, that soldier who has to fight in every single battle, running away in cowardice is worse than death. Well, that's the way that Beth Harmon plays chess. So she played the move knight g2. She decided not to have some fun moving Harry the H pawn down the board. Knight a6. Well, she played a good prophylactic move. Seeing that black wants to go b5 and take all the space on the queen side, she played bishop b3 to anticipate it. And for some reason, black was scared of castling short, maybe seeing the pawn storm on the horizon. Personally, I would say, you know what, I'm not scared, I'm going for it anyway. But black was a bit scared, and he played b5. And the thing with b5 is it does weaken some squares on the c file, where we could imagine, for example, white playing castles, and then bring that knight to that juicy outpost, like knight c1, knight d3, and knight c5. That would be a good strategic plan, and one I think would give white a very serious advantage. Because, I mean, when you have weaknesses like this, I mean, the knight is just begging to enter such squares and invade the opponent's position. So, instead of that little knight tour, white played the move a4, going after the pawn this way. Also not a bad move to try to exploit that weakness. So we had castles, castles. Black brought the queen to e7, finally connecting the rooks. You know, as the old Soviet masters say, you have not entered the endgame until you have connected the rooks. But it turns out there was actually a better move here. In the move knight to h5, which has ideas of trying to bring that knight into that beautiful f4 square, but also clearing the way for f5 to bring the bishop and the rook into the game. And while white is still better, certainly black can hope to try to swindle with an attack on the king side. You know, I've seen it happen in blitz before. Could certainly have happened in this game as well if white wasn't careful. But instead we had queen e7, and now white played a weird move in rook ac1. Now you might say, Max, it's very natural to take the open file with the rook, but the thing is, what grandmasters do is they go beyond the first move that comes to mind. They think, is there a better move in this position? And I think that perhaps the move like knight c1 could have been that better move. Although maybe it's a bit less effective than before when the queen is covering that c5 square. So the other way you could go is knight to g3, where we simply keep this move knight f5 in the air. You know, saying that the threat is strong in the execution, where you go like, okay, knight, no, I'm just kidding. No, I'm just psyching you out, bro. So that's the way I would have played it to make black swelter a little bit. Maybe black should go bishop c5, at least try and trade off the good bishop, but okay, it's a game of chess. Instead we had rook ac1, and here I think if I was black, I would try to do something about this d5 pawn. You know, it's a unwanted intruder. You know, it's like those gate crashers crashing our Christmas party. So I would play the move rook fd8 and go c6, or even maybe c5, and just try to, you know, chip away at this pawn and say, well, without the space, you're not really better. Instead, we had the move knight h5, and white decided to do a little distance 4. And the way that you do the distance 4 is to go g3, and that's why we call it distance 4, because that knight is now completely dominated by the pawn. And, you know, I like the little studies where a pawn dominates a queen, but in an actual game, just even a pawn dominating a knight, it's very efficient. I mean, just imagine if you had 7 pawns dominating the whole black army. I mean, that's real value right there. As it was, the game went h6, you know, making look for the king for when white does a back rank check on move 42. White played the move bishop c2. It's a bit of a weird looking move, but there is a certain logic that it does discourage the move f5. But maybe black should have tried to play it anyway. You know, after b4, knight d1 and f5. I mean, the move f5 wouldn't have been so effective before because, you know, if white can just plonk the knight on the e4 outpost, then black would be very passive. But here it kind of makes a bit more sense because after takes, it's true we are sacrificing a piece, but, you know, to enter the school of Mikhail Tal, you have to sack a piece soundly every second game, or even unsoundly. And after rook to f7, it turns out black actually has pretty decent compensation after knight h4, because white is very hard pressed to defend this pawn. You know, you sink the knight in, the rooks come in, and suddenly, you know, that white king has got some storm clouds gathering around it. So I think that here black would actually have pretty decent play for what it's worth after knight f3 captures and captures. So that's one way the game could have played, and, you know, this was a game between Carlsen against Caruana. This is probably how the game would have gone. But this game was played, you know, back in the 1960s, you know, when people were doing all recreational stuff like, you know, guns and alcohol and other things that are not PG friendly. So let's get into the game with the move rook a to b8. Trying to get some counterplay down that b file, but the one problem is the b file is not yet open. And with the move a b5, we sort of close it, and, you know, now they wish I had the rook back on a8. And indeed, after rook a1, both sides admitted that, you know, it's a new position. You know, let's not remember the past history of how we moved the rook and wasted time. And instead, we're going to play rook a8 and fight for that file. Though if we're up to me, I actually think I would have played it a little bit differently. You know, maybe I'd go bishop h3, b4. You just attack everything and use the Force like we're Luke Skywalker, before we got our arm cut off by Darth Vader. Well, the game saw rook to a8, and now White made an interesting decision. He said, that pawn on b5 is the only real weakness we can get at the moment in Black's position, and he decided to attack it with the move bishop to d3. I think a very interesting alternative, though, would have been to play a move like rook a8, and it might seem weird to give up the open file like that, but the idea is that with knight d1 we say, that open file doesn't do you much good, because if you invade down it, we'll just kick you or we'll just ignore you. And in the meantime, when you get that knight to f2, that king is perfectly safe. We have a very beautiful little fortress, and it allows us to focus then more on trying to bring our knight towards c5 and put the pressure down the c file. It's a long-term plan, but if Black doesn't have a way to create real counterplay, which I don't see at this stage, then you could make an argument that White is fighting for the edge here. Granted, the move that Beth played of bishop d3 is also not bad. And interestingly enough, the move rook a8 is sort of a funny suggestion to computer. To computers, they like to, test our sort of gullibility by suggesting these back and forth shuffling moves to see whether we fall for their little tricks or not. But Borgov didn't fall for it. He played the move bishop b4 saying, you know what, I'm going to play a more active move. I'm not going to give the psychological win over. But there is a price to pay for that. Beth played rook takes a8, rook takes a8. And now she decided to break the pin with the move queen c2. And this I think, was actually a mistake. Now, I want to see if you can play better than Beth Harmon. Can you find the move that White should play here in order to harmonize the pieces like a beautiful Beethoven symphony? Well, my answer is that I really like the move of knight to c1. And the idea of knight c1 is that we simply will put the knight on b3 to stop Black from being able to play bishop c5 so easily. For example, if they play c5, we just go ep, not the Linkin Park EP, but en passant. And then after knight to b3, we're ready to move our rook, sink the knight into c5, that beautiful outpost. Once we break the pin, the b5 pawn's going to be hurting. And it's kind of like a Roy Lopez, but instead of it being a Spanish torture, it's a American torture by Beth Harmon that would be